The heavy oak gate of the St. Jude's Foundling Home for Girls closed with a sound like a final judgment, the iron bolt sliding home with a dead, metallic thud that echoed the closing of a chapter in their lives they had only ever known. Anya and Lena stood on the dusty road, two figures rendered small and insignificant by the vast, indifferent sky of the territory. At 17, the world had deemed them women, and with that designation came expulsion. They clutched a single, shared carpet bag containing 2 worn dresses, a tattered Bible, and a tin of hard biscuits. In Lena's pocket, a legal document, brittle and yellowed, declared them the sole inheritors of their estranged father's only legacy, a 30-acre plot of land nestled against the unforgiving spine of the Blackwood Ridge. The paper felt as thin and useless as a dead leaf. They had never known the man, and the land, they had been told by the matron with a dismissive sniff, was nothing but rock and scrabble, worthless to anyone with sense. The wind, a restless spirit sweeping down from the mountains, tugged at the hems of their plain wool skirts and whipped strands of identical brown hair across their faces. They did not speak. There were no words for this particular kind of abandonment, a severing so complete it left them feeling like ghosts haunting the edges of their own existence. They were twins, a single soul cleaved in two at birth, and in that moment, the silent pressure of Anya's hand in Lena's was the only anchor in a world that had just set them adrift. They began to walk, their worn boots scuffing up clouds of ochre dust, heading west, towards the ridge that loomed on the horizon like a jagged, sleeping beast. The journey took the rest of the day, a silent pilgrimage into their own desolation, and when they finally arrived, the matron's words proved to be a bitter understatement. The land was a testament to nature's cruelty, a steep, cantankerous slope of shale and granite, punctuated by stunted, wind-twisted junipers. It was a place where nothing good could grow. Their inheritance was not a foundation for a future, it was a gravestone for their hopes. As dusk bled purple and orange across the sky, a profound cold began to seep up from the ground, a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature and everything to do with the sheer, crushing weight of their solitude. They found a shallow overhang of rock and huddled beneath it, pulling the single thin blanket from their bag around their shoulders, the meager biscuits tasting like ash in their mouths. The world was vast and empty, and they were utterly, terrifyingly alone within it. Their first nights on the inherited wasteland were a brutal education in misery. The stone beneath them leached warmth from their bodies, and the relentless wind scoured the rock face, whispering of the coming winter with a predatory chill. They ate the last of their biscuits, rationing them into smaller and smaller pieces until only crumbs remained. Hunger became a dull, constant ache in their bellies, a hollow counterpoint to the sharp, piercing ache of despair in their hearts. On the third day, the sound of a horse broke the silence. A man on a stout gelding picked his way up the crude path, a man whose face was a mask of pursed lips and shrewd, calculating eyes. It was Mr. Sterling, the town land agent who had overseen the transfer of the deed. He was their last link to the world they had been cast out from, a world of roofs and walls. He dismounted, his polished boots looking obscene against the wild, untamed ground. He surveyed the rocky slope, his gaze lingering on the pathetic sight of the two girls huddled under the ledge. A flicker of something, not pity, but a cold, satisfied confirmation of his own judgment, crossed his features. "A sorry sight," he said, his voice as dry as the dust. "Just as I told the magistrate. This land is fit for goats and little else." He let the silence hang in the air before continuing. "I am prepared, out of a sense of civic duty, you understand, to take it off your hands. $5. It's more than it's worth, but it will buy you a stagecoach ticket to somewhere with prospects." Lena, always the more direct, found her voice first, a raw thing from a throat tight with cold. "This is all we have." Mr. Sterling gave a short, barking laugh. "You have nothing. You have a piece of paper that says you own the rocks beneath your feet. Winter is coming, girls. The snows on that ridge are merciless. You'll be begging for scraps in town by first frost, or you'll be frozen corpses for the wolves to find in the spring." Anya remained silent, her gaze fixed on him, her eyes absorbing his cruelty without flinching. $5, he repeated, holding out the coins as if offering a cure. "Think on it. I'll be back in a week." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving behind a wake of contempt that felt more chilling than the wind. His departure plunged them into a deeper despair. His words were not just cruel, they were true. Defeated, Lena buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Anya, however, did not weep. Her gaze drifted from the retreating figure of Mr. Sterling to the tree line at the edge of their property, where the dense, ancient forest began. Her eyes, sharpened by desperation, caught a flicker of movement. A small brown bird, a wren, was darting back and forth to a dense thicket, a piece of dry grass in its beak. It was weaving. With meticulous, innate precision, it was lacing strands of grass and horsehair and spider's silk into the curved, intricate architecture of its nest. Anya watched, mesmerized. The bird was not building with planks and nails, not fighting the world with rigid lines, but bending the world to its needs with what was already there. The nest was a dome of profound strength, a shelter made of the forest's softest, most pliable offerings, woven together into something that could withstand the very winds that now tormented them. A thought, quiet and revolutionary, began to form in her mind. It was a spark in the vast darkness. She touched Lena's shoulder. "Look," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Lena lifted her tear-streaked face and followed her sister's gaze to the tiny, industrious creature. She saw the weaving, the patient construction, the creation of a home from nothing. The sob subsided, replaced by a dawning, fragile wonder. They were not goats. They were not corpses. They were weavers. The decision, once made, settled in their bones with the weight of absolute necessity. They abandoned the cold, weeping stone of the overhang and moved to the edge of their property, crossing the invisible line that separated the barren rock from the living forest. The air changed immediately, the wind softening as it filtered through the dense congregation of pine and aspen. The ground underfoot was a soft carpet of fallen needles and damp earth, smelling of life and decay, a scent of promise. They walked for hours, deeper into the woods, not with a destination in mind but with a purpose. They were searching for a place that felt right, a place that would consent to becoming their home. They found it in a small, sheltered clearing, a natural bowl protected on three sides by a crescent of ancient, towering pines whose massive trunks stood like silent sentinels. In the center of this clearing, a cluster of young, whip-thin aspens grew in a rough circle, their smooth, pale bark gleaming in the dappled sunlight. They were strong, deeply rooted, and alive. These would be their walls, the living ribs of their shelter. The work began with a shared, unspoken understanding. Using a small, rust-pocked hatchet they found in their father's derelict lean-to, they cleared the brush and stones from the center of the aspen circle, defining the floor of their future home. The labor was grueling. Their hands, soft from years of indoor chores at the orphanage, were soon raw and blistered. Their muscles screamed with the unaccustomed strain of clearing and digging. But with every rock they moved, with every thorny vine they tore away, they were not just clearing ground, they were claiming a space in the world, marking it as their own. The next step was the most crucial. They had to bend the living aspens. Anya, the lighter of the two, would climb a sapling, her slight weight causing it to arc gracefully towards the center of the circle. Lena would then catch the bent tip, and together, they would wrestle it downwards, their combined strength just enough to hold it in place while the other sister quickly and tightly bound it to the tip of the opposing sapling. For rope, they harvested the long, fibrous inner bark of fallen birch trees, peeling it away in strips that were surprisingly strong and pliable. They repeated this process, crisscrossing the clearing with bowed, living arches, until the aspen saplings formed a domed skeleton, a framework that breathed and shifted with the wind. It was a structure born of cooperation, not conquest. There were moments of profound doubt. One afternoon, exhausted and aching, Lena slumped to the ground, looking at their raw, bleeding hands. "This is madness, Anya," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We're children playing a game." Sterling was right. "A strong wind will snap these branches." Anya, wiping sweat and dirt from her brow, simply pointed to the top of the dome, where the lashed branches strained and flexed against a sudden gust, giving way just enough to dissipate its force before returning to their shape. "A stone wall would fight the wind and break," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "We are learning to bend with it." The truth of her words settled between them. Their weakness, their lack of brute strength and rigid materials, was forcing them to find a different kind of power, a resilience rooted in yielding, not resisting. They were not building a cabin. They were weaving a sanctuary. With the living frame of their home established, the true weaving began. It was a slow, methodical process, a craft learned through the patient observation of spiders and birds. Each morning, they would venture into the forest, their eyes scanning the undergrowth not for food, but for building materials. They gathered fallen branches of every size, dragging them back to the clearing and sorting them into piles. Thick, sturdy limbs for the base, long, flexible willow and birch switches for the main weave, and slender, twiggy branches to fill the gaps. Their hands, now calloused and tough, became extensions of their will. They started at the bottom of the dome, forcing the thicker branches horizontally between the vertical aspen ribs, creating a solid, waist-high foundation. It was like weaving a giant, upside-down basket. The branches scraped their arms and tore at their clothes, but with each one they locked into place, the structure grew more solid, more real. Above the foundation, they switched to the more pliable branches, lacing them in and out, over and under, creating a tight, interlocking lattice. They discovered that by weaving in opposing diagonal patterns, they could create a wall of immense strength and integrity. Days blurred into a single, continuous act of creation. Their world shrank to the size of their small clearing, their senses attuned to the snap of a twig, the heft of a branch, the satisfying tension of a well-placed switch. They worked in a comfortable, practiced silence, their movements synchronized, each knowing what the other needed without a word. Anya, with her longer reach, often worked on the higher sections, while Lena, with her meticulous attention to detail, focused on making the lower weave as dense and tight as possible. The structure slowly lost its skeletal appearance, becoming a solid, curved form, its surface a complex tapestry of bark and wood. It began to look less like a pile of sticks and more like a natural feature of the forest, a giant, overturned bird's nest that had risen organically from the earth. One afternoon, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. It was Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife from the nearby town, a woman who had occasionally slipped them an extra biscuit during their orphanage years. She carried a small cloth sack and wore an expression of profound concern. Her eyes widened as she took in the sight before her, the two girls, smudged with dirt and sweat, methodically weaving the walls of their strange, domed hut. She saw the raw blisters on their hands, the fierce concentration in their eyes. "Dear heavens, children," she breathed, stepping closer. She placed the sack on the ground, the scent of fresh bread and cheese wafted from it. "I heard what Sterling said in town. I was so worried. But this, what is this?" "It's our home," Lena said simply, not stopping her work. Mrs. Gable reached out and touched the woven wall. It was rough but surprisingly solid. Her face was a storm of conflicting emotions, pity, admiration, and deep, deep skepticism. "Girls, this is no way to live," she pleaded softly. "Winter will kill you in this basket. There are positions in town. I could speak to the pastor for you. You could be maids, have a real roof over your heads." Anya paused her weaving and looked at the kind woman. "Thank you for the food, Mrs. Gable. But we are staying." The finality in her tone left no room for argument. Mrs. Gable shook her head sadly, her compassionate heart convinced of their folly. She left the food and retreated from the clearing, her departing shadow long and full of doubt. The sisters watched her go, then wordlessly shared the bread and cheese, the first decent meal they'd had in weeks. It strengthened their bodies, but it was the woman's doubt that truly hardened their resolve. They would prove them all wrong. The woven shell was only the beginning. A basket, however strong, could not keep out the biting cold. To transform it into a home, they needed two things, a hearth for fire and a seal against the wind. The fire came first. In the exact center of the hut, directly beneath the small opening they had deliberately left at the apex of the dome, they began to dig. Using the flat edge of their hatchet and sharpened stones, they excavated a shallow, circular pit in the hard-packed earth. This task was slow and frustrating, their progress measured in handfuls of dirt. Once the pit was about a foot deep, they lined it with smooth, flat stones they carried one by one from a nearby creek bed. They chose the stones with care, rejecting any that were porous or cracked, knowing that the wrong kind of rock could explode in the heat of a fire. They mortared them together with a thick, sticky clay they found by that same creek, creating a solid, safe basin for their future fires. The chimney was a greater challenge. They built a narrow collar of stones and clay around the smoke hole at the top of the dome, extending it a few feet above the woven roof to help draw the smoke upwards and to prevent falling embers from igniting the dry branches. Getting the stones up there was a perilous task, requiring Anya to climb the curved outer wall like a squirrel while Lena passed the heavy, clay-coated rocks up to her. Their creation was no longer just a shelter, it was becoming a living space, designed around the central, life-giving principle of warmth. Next, they turned their attention to the walls. The weave was tight, but the wind still found its way through 1,000 tiny gaps. They returned to the creek and spent days digging up buckets of clay, which they mixed with water, dry moss, and pine needles to create a thick, insulating daub. Then came the messy, laborious process of plastering the entire interior of the hut. They smeared the mixture into the woven walls with their bare hands, pushing it deep into every crack and crevice, covering the branches until the inside was a smooth, curved surface of packed earth and moss. It was cold, filthy work, but as they sealed the final gap, a profound change occurred. The relentless whisper of the wind was silenced. The interior of the dome became still and quiet, the sounds of the forest muted and distant. Sunlight, filtering through the smoke hole, illuminated a space that felt protected, ancient, and deeply peaceful. It was a womb against the wilderness. While one worked on the hut, the other was always focused on the relentless, unending task of gathering firewood. The coming winter was a predator they had to outsmart, and warmth was their only weapon. They couldn't fell large trees, so they became expert scavengers, collecting the fallen deadwood that littered the forest floor. They learned to distinguish the fast-burning pine from the slow, hot burn of oak. They broke the wood into manageable lengths, hauling it back to the clearing and stacking it in 3 great piles against the outer wall of the hut, positioned to act as additional windbreaks. Their lives fell into a simple, exhausting rhythm: gather, build, seal, stack. It was a race against the sun, which dipped lower in the sky each day, its light growing thinner, its warmth more fleeting. With the shelter itself nearing completion, their focus shifted to sustenance. The forest that had provided the materials for their home now had to become their larder. The handful of biscuits and the charity of Mrs. Gable were long gone, and the gnawing hunger had returned, a constant reminder of their precarious existence. They began to forage with a desperate intensity, applying the scant lessons on edible plants they'd half listened to during nature walks at the orphanage. They learned to identify the hardy roots of wild carrots and the starchy tubers of cattails in the marshy areas near the creek. They spent hours on their hands and knees, digging in the dirt with sharpened sticks, their fingers numb with cold, for the small, precious bounty the earth offered up. Late-season blackberries, shriveled but intensely sweet, still clung to thorny bushes, and they gathered every one, their arms and hands crisscrossed with scratches. They collected acorns by the sackful, learning to leach the bitter tannins from them by soaking them in the running water of the creek, a trick they observed a squirrel doing, and then roasting them on the hot stones of their hearth until they were edible, if not delicious. Their greatest prize came from that same creek. Lena, using a length of twine from their bag and a pin bent into a hook, spent an entire day sitting silently on the bank, her patience absolute. Just as the light was failing, she felt a tug. She pulled in a small, speckled trout, its silver body flashing in the twilight. It felt like a miracle. They cooked it over the fire that night, the smell of roasting fish filling their small home, and ate it with a reverence reserved for sacred things. It was more than food, it was a victory, proof that they could not just endure, but provide. Food storage was as critical as the gathering itself. Inside the hut, against one wall, they dug a small, deep hole, their own miniature root cellar. They lined it carefully with flat stones to keep out moisture and burrowing animals, and fashioned a lid from a tightly woven mat of pine boughs. Here they stored their precious collection of roots and tubers, hoping the cool, dark earth would preserve them. For the fish they managed to catch, they built a small, crude smoker next to the hut, a teepee of green branches covered in damp leaves, and smoked the strips of trout over a low, smoldering fire for days until they were dry and leathery, preserved against the coming scarcity. Their existence was pared down to its essentials: warmth, shelter, food. Every waking moment was dedicated to securing one of these 3 things. The world of the orphanage, of lessons and bells and clean linens, felt like a distant dream, a life lived by someone else. This new life was hard, brutal, and relentless, but it was also theirs. Every root they dug, every fish they caught, every branch they stacked was a testament to their own resilience. They were no longer orphans waiting to be cared for, they were survivors, shaping their own destiny with calloused hands and an unbreakable will. The forest, once a place of fear, was becoming their partner, a stern but ultimately generous provider. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. A hard frost silvered the forest floor each morning, and the aspens surrounding their clearing shed their golden leaves, leaving a filigree of bare branches against a steel-grey sky. The air had a new, sharper edge to it, a clean, cold scent that promised snow. It was on one such morning that Mr. Sterling returned. He rode his horse right to the edge of the clearing, his expression a mixture of disbelief and irritation. He had expected to find them gone, or worse. He had not expected to find this. The woven dome, now daubed with clay and banked with enormous piles of firewood, looked like a permanent feature of the landscape. A thin, steady plume of smoke rose from the stone chimney at its peak, a clear declaration of life and defiance. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the frosted leaves. Still playing squirrels in the woods, he sneered, though his voice lacked the confident derision of his last visit. He walked around the structure, prodding at the woven walls with the tip of his riding crop. They were unyielding, solid as a drum. "A stiff wind will tear this pile of sticks to shreds," he declared, repeating his earlier prophecy as if saying it louder would make it true. "The first real storm will bury you. I'll give you $10 for the land." Final offer. He held out the coins, the metal glinting coldly in the thin light. "Take it before you freeze. Go to the city. Find work." Anya and Lena emerged from the low entrance of their home, their faces smudged with soot, their eyes clear and steady. They did not look like victims. They looked like homesteaders. They stood together, a united front, and it was Lena who answered, her voice low and devoid of fear. "This is our home," she said, the word simple and solid as the stones of their hearth. "It is not for sale." Mr. Sterling stared at them, his frustration mounting. Their survival was an affront to his worldview, an illogical and infuriating anomaly. He saw their defiance not as strength but as foolish, childish stubbornness. "Have it your way," he spat, his face flushing with anger. "When the blizzard hits, and you're freezing in the dark, remember this day. Remember the $10 that could have saved you." He swung himself back onto his horse, his movements jerky and aggressive. "Don't come crying to the town when your little nest collapses." He spurred his horse and galloped away, his angry departure swallowed by the profound silence of the forest. As the sound of his horse's hoofs faded, a single, perfect snowflake drifted down from the grey sky and landed on Anya's cheek, where it melted like a cold tear. Then another fell, and another. They were not the gentle, fleeting flakes of early autumn. These were large and heavy, portents of the storm he had promised. The wind began to rise, moaning through the tops of the great pines. The threat was no longer a distant whisper. It was here. They exchanged a look, not of fear, but of grim readiness. They retreated into the warmth of their home, pulling a heavy, hide-covered flap over the entrance, and added another log to the fire. Outside, the world began to turn white. The storm did not arrive, it descended. It fell upon the forest not with the fury of a passing tantrum but with the crushing, deliberate weight of an invading army. The wind came first, a low moan that grew into a shrieking, demented howl. It tore at the forest, ripping through the canopy, searching for weakness. Inside the hut, the sisters listened as the gale hit their home. They felt the impact as a deep, resonant thrum, but the curved, aerodynamic shape of their dome offered no flat surfaces for the wind to purchase. It flowed over and around them, the woven walls flexing and groaning with the strain but holding firm, bending instead of breaking. Then came the snow. It was not a gentle blanket but a blinding, suffocating torrent, a vertical blizzard that erased the world. It fell with a relentless, hissing sound, piling up against the hut with astonishing speed. Soon, the light from the smoke hole dimmed, and a strange, filtered twilight filled the small space. They were being buried. Anya and Lena huddled together by the hearth, the flickering firelight casting their giant, dancing shadows against the curved, clay walls. The fire was their anchor, their sun, their defiant heart beating against the frozen fist of the storm. They fed it sparingly, knowing their woodpile, as vast as it was, had to last. Outside, the sounds were terrifying. The howl of the wind was punctuated by the sharp crack of breaking branches and, occasionally, the thunderous, earth-shaking crash of a falling giant, an ancient tree surrendering to the storm's violence. With each crash, they would flinch, imagining the tons of wood and snow obliterating everything in their path. The weight of the snow on their roof grew immense. They could hear it, a deep, creaking protest from the bent aspen ribs that formed the dome's skeleton. This was the true test. Mr. Sterling's words echoed in the roaring darkness, "Your little nest collapses." But their nest had been designed by the wisdom of the wren, a creature that understood the physics of winter. The snow, the very thing meant to crush them, began to serve them. As it piled deeper and deeper, it ceased to be a weight and became a shell, a thick, seamless blanket of insulation. The sounds of the storm became muffled, the terrifying shrieks of the wind softening to a distant, mournful cry. A profound quiet settled within the hut. The cold that had seeped through the daubed walls was sealed off. The precious heat from their small fire, no longer escaping, was trapped with them. The temperature inside the dome actually began to rise, becoming not just bearable, but comfortable. They were entombed in a cocoon of snow, protected from the storm's rage by the very substance of the storm itself. They were terrified, yet they were safe. For 3 days and 3 nights, the blizzard raged, and for 3 days and 3 nights, the sisters existed in their subterranean twilight world, sustained by smoked fish, roasted acorns, and the steady, courageous beat of their own hearts. They had built well. They had bent with the wind, and they had been rewarded with survival. On the morning of the 4th day, they awoke to an almost supernatural silence. The wind had ceased its tormented howling, and the hissing of the snow had stopped. The only sound was the quiet crackle of the embers in their hearth. A pale, ethereal light filtered down through the smoke hole, which was now a deep, narrow tunnel through the snowpack. They knew the storm was over. The air inside the hut was thick and heavy, and they realized they needed to get out, to breathe fresh air, to see the sky. The entrance flap was sealed by a wall of snow so densely packed it was like ice. Escape that way was impossible. Their only path to the world was up. Anya, being the more agile, stood on a small pile of firewood to give her height, and began the arduous process of clawing her way up the chimney of snow above the smoke hole. The snow was compacted and heavy, and she had to dig at it with her bare, numb hands, pushing the dislodged clumps down into the hut where they melted into puddles on the warm stone hearth. Lena stood below, bracing her, offering words of encouragement, her face upturned and anxious. After what felt like an eternity, Anya's hand broke through the surface. She was met with a light so brilliant, so blindingly white, that it made her cry out. She clawed the rest of the way, pulling her head and shoulders into the open air. The world was gone. It had been replaced by a new one, a landscape sculpted from pure white, silent and breathtakingly beautiful. The snow was easily 10 feet deep, burying everything but the tops of the tallest pines, which stood draped in white, their branches bowed low. In the distance, down in the valley, she could see the devastation. The roof of a large barn had collapsed into a V-shape under the weight of the snow. Several smaller outbuildings had simply vanished. It was a scene of utter destruction, rendered peaceful and sterile by its white shroud. Later that day, they heard the faint sound of shouting. A search party from the town was making its slow way up the ridge on snowshoes, the men moving laboriously through the deep drifts. At the lead was Mrs. Gable, her face etched with grim worry, and behind her, a reluctant Mr. Sterling, his own face a mask of grim obligation. They were not expecting to find survivors. They were on a grim mission to recover the bodies of the 2 foolish girls. As they neared the clearing, they stopped, confused. The girls' shelter was nowhere to be seen. There was only a large, smooth mound of snow, indistinguishable from the rest of the landscape, except for one impossible detail, a thin, grey wisp of smoke curling lazily from its peak. They stared, uncomprehending. Then, as if in a dream, the top of the snow mound shifted, and a figure emerged from it, smudged with soot and blinking in the bright sun. It was Anya. A moment later, Lena's head appeared beside hers. They were alive. Mrs. Gable cried out, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief, and began struggling through the snow toward them. Mr. Sterling stood frozen, his jaw slack. He looked from the two living girls to the smoking snow mound, then back down towards the valley where the solid, professionally built roof of his own large storehouse had been crushed by the storm, ruining half his winter inventory. The sight before him of this primitive, impossible shelter and its thriving inhabitants was a profound and humbling refutation of everything he believed about strength, value, and the proper order of the world. The image of the two sisters emerging from the snow, healthy and whole, sent a ripple of disbelief and then awe through the town. They were no longer the orphan girls, a subject of pity and cautionary tales. They became a local legend, the Weaver sisters of Blackwood Ridge. Mrs. Gable reached them first, her face wet with tears, and enveloped them in a hug that spoke of a deep and genuine relief that transcended her earlier skepticism. She looked at the snow-covered dome from which they had emerged, her eyes tracing the impossible plume of smoke. We were sure you were lost," she stammered, her voice thick with emotion. She looked at their home, this thing she had dismissed as a basket, and saw it now for what it was, a miracle of ingenuity. Her pity had transformed into a profound respect. Mr. Sterling arrived moments later, his face pale and unreadable. He stood before them, the arrogant land agent humbled by a pile of woven sticks and two teenage girls. He said nothing. There was nothing he could say. His rigid, conventional world of deeds and dollars had been shattered by the simple, undeniable truth of their survival. His sturdy buildings had failed where their pliable, living shelter had succeeded. He looked at them, then at the wisp of smoke, and without a word, he turned and trudged back down the mountain, his defeat as silent and heavy as the snow around him. The sisters' story became a quiet inspiration, a piece of local folklore told around winter fires. Trappers and homesteaders, men who thought they knew everything about surviving the wilderness, would make their way up to the clearing to see the structure for themselves. They would run their hands over the tightly woven walls, marveling at the simple genius of its design. They saw how the dome shed the snow, how its flexibility allowed it to endure the wind, how its semi-subterranean nature used the earth itself for insulation. The sisters' perceived folly was revealed to be a deep, instinctual wisdom. They had not conquered the wilderness, they had listened to it. They lived out the rest of the winter in their woven home, not just surviving, but thriving. They had proven that strength was not always found in rigidity, and that a home was not defined by planks and nails, but by the warmth and safety it contained. Their triumph was not loud or boastful, it was as quiet and enduring as the forest itself. They had arrived with nothing but a worthless piece of paper and had built a legacy from the refuse of the forest floor, a testament to the enduring power of resilience, patience, and the unconventional wisdom that sees a fortress in a bird's nest. As spring finally arrived, melting the great mounds of snow and revealing the green life beneath, Anya and Lena sat outside their home, watching the forest reawaken. The world was no longer a vast, intimidating emptiness. It was their partner, their provider, their home. They had woven themselves into the fabric of the place, and in doing so, had found a belonging more profound than any orphanage or town could ever offer.